So one of the points that there was a fair amount of struggle around this was the notion of integrating existing literature into these, personal narratives. And there are different levels of doing that and also expectations of doing that. So when you want to define your work as autoethnographic, there is an assumption there, an expectation that your story is going to be linked in some way to sort of wider cultural practices and societal expectations. So, but how that happens can show up in many, many different ways. So, for example, one of the dissertations that I reference, she, and her name is fallen out of my head right now, but she did a study about Indigenous learning and Indigenous language. And it was partly autobiographical. So she did a study, she looked at relevant literature around revitalization of Indigenous languages as essential to decolonization and self-determination. So she had a fair amount of, traditional academic literature, much of it written by Indigenous scholars. And then in her own process of learning from an elder, her own language, is that Sharon? No. It'll come to me in a minute. She was referencing and linking back her own personal experience of learning to relevant literature that's actually talking about the learning of a original language. So another person I know who did an autoethnographic study was Valerie Lee Chapman, and she was one of the first in our departments. She graduated in the 90s, and what she did was studied she wanted to understand why she was the educator she was. So she actually went back. She reviewed a lot of relevant literature that talked about, philosophy of practices from different perspectives. She actually went back, she was originally from the UK, interviewed teachers that she had when she was young, interviewed boyfriends that she had. She even went to the boarding school. Boarding school was a huge event in her life, not such a great influence as it is for many. So she actually went back to that site and took pictures. So in her desert, so that's a very deep, expanded, I would say, autoethnographic study. But in some sense, when you call it ethnographic, there is an expectation that you're locating yourself or linking yourself to wider kind of cultural meanings and practices. Mm-hmm. So when it's autobiographical, that's less of an expectation, but what you should be doing is reading a great deal of the literature, and there is a reference list on the module that's about this methodology and all of it, and there's more and more coming out every day. Mm-hmm. And to actually understand some of the questions that people have, the challenges that you might make. So that's locating your work in the methodological discussion. But the other thing too is that, and I think for Gina, this is true for you, is and it came out of your writing, some of the things that you knew when you went in, that notions of transformation, for example, were very important to you. But as you wrote your story, particularly that one story about the one day in your life as an educator, certain key themes started to come up. Themes like welcoming and creating a space of invitation for others, which took you to some other writings. Parker Palmer was one of them that you found very powerful and influential. But there were others like Vygotsky, I think. I don't know if that was you or another student. So how you tie up your personal story to others, it's an expectation, but it's not predetermined. Mm-hmm. So as you write, sort of then this is in the conversation with others, hopefully your supervisor, I can say, you know what, I noticed this about a strong theme that comes out of your writing, and that might then take you to reading some others. So it's a kind of iterative process. You don't start with the typical sort of theoretical framework. it actually comes in concert with you telling your story and realizing this is actually important. Maybe I wouldn't have called it transformative learning before, but I see that now. So then you might go and read some relevant literature about that. And there will be different sort of concepts embedded in your story that will take you to that literature. How it gets integrated is really, there's no template for that. But there is an expectation that somehow you will link your personal story to others that have said something about that. But in a sense, it's your decision, obviously in conversation with others, that this particular idea, and it's related to a scholar who's maybe written about these notions, this is the one that really sings for me. So it's really about finding someone else whose writing and academic publishing helps you to think more deeply. Or is it, this person is actually writing about something I experienced. So those selections and choices about the literature that you integrate really come out of your own narrative that you've written. And you choose them. Like, you don't have to cover the entire territory.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Any philosopher who's ever written about, being a human being, which is kind of the entire history of philosophy, actually. But so you need to make some choices and also be aware of the choices that you make about the particular authors that you chose to then weave in to this story. So it's kind of it's a way of weaving that creates a bit of a flow.